Is this thing gonna tip over and crush me in the most ridiculous possible way to die? I don't know. Guess we'll find out. I give it even odds. Hello Internet, my name is Quinn, and this is Blondihacks. I am this close to being found dead by authorities, crushed under a pile of scrap metal of my own creation. Don't get me wrong, it's a heck of a way to go, but not today. Let's start with the scope of the problem. This is my primary material storage area, or junk pile is perhaps more accurate. It's just a shelf bolted to the wall to keep most of the stuff off the floor, though you can see there's still stuff on the floor. And while it stores lots of large stuff, it's very difficult to find anything because everything gets buried behind everything else. Later I mounted these tubes on the wall for storing bar stock, and these work really well, so I'd like to carry this idea over. This was my original stock storage solution. It's just a big bin under the lathe, and this thing is a disaster. It's so full of miscellaneous, I can't find anything, and it's gotten so heavy that I can barely move it, and frankly, it's starting to get dangerous. Then there's this area here, which is actually working quite well for all my really little stuff. This is all sorted by material and alloy, and so I definitely want to carry this idea over. At some point I added this small miscellaneous bin. I don't know why. Random stuff in there. And lately I've started accumulating copper in this random bin sitting on the bench just because I needed somewhere to put all this copper. Not good. So here's what I designed in CAD to hopefully absorb all 6 of these disparate and terrible material storage solutions. It's a series of shelves designed around Sterilite bins. You might have noticed I like those. So this is specifically designed around the 3 most common sizes that I use, the very large ones at the bottom, and then a medium and a small size up top. So this will give me plenty of storage for the scraps of various sizes, and I can sort by alloy and type and so on. And then up top there is an angled kind of riffle sort area for small sheet stock. And then at the back is a 4-inch gap up against the wall for the large stock, so 4x8 sheets of plywood, things like that. And then on the ends I've got a series of those tubes that I like for storing bar stock. I like storing bar stock vertically. A lot of people do it horizontally, but horizontally things get piled up on each other and they get bent if they're not well supported, and it's hard to find what you've got. And so yeah, I like storing things vertically, so that's what I'm going to do here. The whole thing is made out of 1-inch square tubing, 1/8 wall, so there's going to be a lot of steel tubing, and well, here's a lot of steel tubing. The friendly local steel yard dropped this off, and we are ready to go. Everything else is going to be made with scraps that I have lying around the shop. I only purchased the steel. It always makes me happy to use stuff up that I have lying around. Now you can of course buy material storage racks, but they basically come in 2 categories. There's the metal shelving systems sold by big box stores. I find them all kind of flimsy and not that attractive, and they don't really suit my needs very well. The other solution are the big heavy industrial scale ones, and those are extremely expensive, like many thousands of dollars. I also need something that can fit exactly in the space where this current storage pile is, because I really don't have any other place in my shop for storage. So I need something that will fit in this same space but hold 4 or 5 times as much stuff, and I think this design will do it. For all that steel, I started with a cut list generated from my CAD drawing there. I just sketched out some of the major components as well. I didn't bother generating a drawing in Fusion 360 for this. And the real hero of this project is the horizontal bandsaw, this little cheapo 4x6 that everybody owns. These things are really great saws, honestly. For the money, the value that they bring to my shop is really shocking. This is one of those purchases I didn't expect to get nearly as much value out of as I do. It makes great cuts, and when you've got a project like this where I'm looking at 60, 70, 80 cuts, that's, a lot of cutting. It would be a tremendous amount of work any other way. And the better your cuts are, the better your welds are going to be, so that's really important. When cutting really long pieces of stock like this, make sure to support both ends on either side of the saw, because otherwise, if you only support one end after the cut, suddenly the other end has no counterweight and the saw can tip over. I'm using my hydraulic lift cart as an outfeed table there. You can also see my hand on the saw there. Another pro tip with these is when it gets into the thin wall area in the center, it starts cutting a lot faster and actually starts cutting too fast. The cut will go crooked if the blade is pushing through too quickly. So I hold my hand on the carriage there and just kind of slow it down a little bit until it gets into the thick part at the bottom again. These saws have a counterweight spring on them that's supposed to be adjustable for that purpose. I don't find it works very well. It's pretty standard for the steel to come in 20-foot sections, which is very, very large. So the steel yard will typically cut them for you if you ask. So I ask for them to be cut in half because I can manage 10 feet in my shop. But pro tip, don't rely on the Steelyard to cut them the same lengths. So I'm measuring every cut because here's the offcuts from 2 lengths, and you can see how off they are. So when planning your cut lists, don't assume your pieces are all exactly 10 feet. Next, I'm going to get the welder set up. So I've got a couple of offcut scraps here, and I'm going to test my settings, make sure that I'm going to get good welds here. I'm cleaning up these scraps with a Scotch-Brite disc on the angle grinder. It's kind of like a flap wheel, but made of Scotch-Brite. I actually don't like it very much. I'm just trying to use it up here. So that'll prep those surfaces for welding, and I'll do a couple of test beads here. So the first pass is just the settings recommended on the lid inside the welder. Always a decent place to start. That's not bad. That would probably be fine. It looks a little cold. It's sitting proud of the surface more than I would like. So I went up 1 voltage setting on the wire feed MIG here and do another test. I'm testing with this T-shape here because this also has all of the joints that I'm going to be doing on the real thing. I've got inside 90s, and I've got that butt joint with square tubing up against the rounded corner. And look, I'm not a great welder. Don't watch my videos to learn how to weld. I'm not even going to try to give you any tips on welding because I'm not a good welder. If you do want to learn how to weld, I'm going to recommend Make It Custom. He's got an awesome intro to MIG video that I'll link to in the description below, and he's also a fellow crazy Canuck, so I gotta recommend him. So I played with the settings a little bit more and landed somewhere that I like. All those welds except the first one look pretty good to me. Again, not saying these are objectively good welds. The only takeaway from this video for you should be that someone who's not a very good welder can still build a very functional set of shop shelves. Onto the real thing now. I've got a flap disc on there, and I'm prepping the ends of my various pieces here. So the areas to be welded need to be cleaned up, and I'm deburring things as well. I'm going to start with the frame that makes up the base. The second hero after the bandsaw on this project is the Mini Monster Square that you can see there. Hashtag not sponsored, but this thing is really great for little fabrication projects like this. It's not just a square that you can clamp, it's got those tabs on the bottom. The magic of those tabs is that in addition to keeping the pieces square, they keep the ends of the pieces that you're not welding coplanar. It's actually fairly difficult to make an 8-foot long rectangle and not end up with any twist in it, and the Mini Monster Square really goes a long way to doing that. So I'm just setting up each corner and tacking it in place, and I'll weld everything up after once I'm sure everything is square. If you don't have the fancy Mini Monster Square, I would suggest the 3 points method, which is where you put something round under the joint you're welding and then something round under the far ends of both pieces. And that way, both ends of both pieces are sitting on effectively a single point of contact, and 3 points of contact always form a plane, and that will ensure that your pieces are coplanar when you're done. After everything is tacked up, now I can check for square and flatness everywhere. It's very important to do this now because with everything tacked, we can still modify it. We can twist things, bend things, pop tacks apart if needed, redo them, that sort of thing. Once it's all welded up, we're committed. So everything looks really good here, so I'm going to start welding things up. And this is all pretty straightforward beads. The nice thing about working with this square tubing is that the rounded corners form a natural V on the butt joints and gives you a nice place to set the weld down into. You don't have to grind 45-degree angles on all your joints. Saves you a lot of time. So the first weld went pretty decently, so I can move on, and I'm just welding up every side of every joint like this, and I'm just kind of moving around to spread the heat around. This is really heavy wall tubing, so it's not likely to distort too much, but just in case, I'm trying to keep the heat moving around as much as possible. This is all flux core wire feed MIG, by the way. No gases needed, so it's a great choice for hobbyists and farmers alike. The other thing I'm doing is I'm rotating the piece so that my welds are always horizontal. Because I'm a rookie welder, I want to avoid welding vertically or upside down as much as possible. It's much easier to get a decent weld if you're welding a straight, horizontal, flat joint. Now, one bit of uncertainty I had in my design was whether I was going to need vertical risers in the middles of these long shelves. I wasn't sure how much deflection I was going to get on that tubing. You can use online steel deflection calculators, but it's hard from those to get an intuitive sense of, how strong something is really going to be. So with this frame welded up, I can finally do a strength test with some ballast. So with this none of your business amount of weight on the center there, you can see we've got quite a bit of deflection. Now this is what's called a free end test. The ends are not supported by anything. So there's going to be a lot less deflection in this in the final frame, and there's not going to be, let's say, nearly that much weight in the middle. And so I'll do this test again once we've got more of the frame built, and I'm keeping the option open to add those vertical stringers if needed. So With the bottom frame welded up, I'm going to mount the wheels on the bottom here while it's easy to do so. So I'm just marking those. Got these big heavy casters from my steel yard as well. They sell some hardware like this. I'm just going to drill and tap these. Because this is thick wall tubing, I've got enough thickness here to where I can tap fine pitch threads directly into the side walls there. As long as you've got at least 3 threads in there, that's enough meat, especially for something like this where the bolts aren't holding any real weight. They're just keeping the rats from stealing the wheels from underneath. I should say here that I'm never going to move it on these wheels when it's fully loaded. I don't think it's going to be super stable because it is very narrow and fairly tall. The wheels are just so that the rack is movable once it's empty, because I know I'm going to have to move my shop sometime in the future, and this way I can just pull all the bins off and roll the rack right into the truck. I do have a couple of outside corners on the framework, and for this saw has yet another awesome trick. It can do very nice 45-degree miters. The vise will go all the way over to 45. And again, if you've got it well set up so that it cuts very straight, then you get very nice, clean miters. The accuracy of this cut is everything as far as how good your final outside miter corner is going to be. So you can see there, once you've got that saw set up nicely, you actually get very nice outside mitered corners. Very easy to weld up when you've got a joint that good. And I shot the rest of this project with a broken tripod, because I love you. These outside miter corners are being prepped a little differently. I am grinding 45-degree angles on that to give the weld somewhere to sit down in there, since these are just flat square tubing butted up together. There's no rounded corner to take advantage of here. Sometimes all the care in the world to keep things square isn't enough, and you end up with something a little bit off somewhere, especially on frames this large. These frames are 8 feet long. So I've got a bit of a splay here at the bottom, and a ratchet strap is a great way to pull things back into alignment. Again, things are just tacked at this point, so it's pretty easy to muscle it around as needed. So you can clamp things, you can ratchet strap, you can even hammer a little bit if needed. With everything squared up, I can once again weld all of this up. So this is the vertical frame that I'm building now. It forms kind of the back plane between the large sheet stock storage area and the backs of the shelves. As much as possible, I'm using my jack stands and also my hydraulic lift cart to keep the work up off the floor. I really hate working on the floor. Everything is twice as much work when you're working on the floor. So I'm using that here to kind of get the pieces aligned, the 2 major frames here that form the center of the shelving unit. And the hydraulic lift cart was awesome for getting these pieces aligned. When you work alone on big projects like this, hydraulics are your friend. The Mini Monster Square made short work of squaring up these 2 major frameworks, and I'm really taking my time here because these 2 frameworks and their relationship to each other is going to set the quality for the rest of the entire build. If these aren't right, nothing else has any chance of being right. So I took a lot of time and took a lot of measurements to get this perfect. Space is also a challenge. Luckily, I skipped that extra cheeseburger last night. This project is so big that it fills the entire work area that I have in my shop, so I'm really kind of bending and squishing my way around this thing. I was very glad when it was done because I could not do anything else in my shop until this thing was finished and out of here. Once again, lots of measuring, make sure everything is good before I move on and weld everything up. With tubing this long also, the tubing often has a bend in it, and so you have to be ready for that and compensate for that as needed. It's not just your setups that are making things out of square. The tubing isn't going to be perfect either. For these outside corners, I decided not to put any weld on there. The tubing is so thin there that it would burn through, and I'd end up piling a bunch of weld on it and grinding it square again anyway. And this is an indoor project. I don't have to worry about water ingress, so there's really no point in welding up those corners. Onto the shelves now. I can do a little mass production because all 3 shelves are the same with different height risers on them. With the 3 shelf frameworks done, I need to do a little bit of woodworking now before I can move on. The shelves are covered in plywood, so I've got this sheet that I've had in storage for many, many years, and I'm very glad to use it up. It's crappy stuff, but it'll be just fine for shop shelving. I don't have a table saw or a track saw or anything fancy like that. What I do have is a handheld skill saw and an 8-foot straight edge. This is not a lot of fun on the floor, but you go to war with the army you have. These shelves get notched around the vertical uprights here, so that's an easy job. I can trace their locations directly onto the wood here, and then I cut these out with a jigsaw. This should be very satisfying if it works. Oh yeah, look at that. And then that skinny little piece goes on the back there. That's the floor of the shelf for the large stock area, if you will. So you can see how that all works. And I'm scribing out for some screw holes here. The shelves will be held down with countersunk machine screws. So I've got the tap drill size for the screws I'm going to use. I clamp the wood in place and I'm just drilling straight through the wood and the metal with the tap drill size. Again, the wall thickness on this tubing is sufficient to get more than 3 threads in there for the machine screws that I'm using, which are very fine threads, so this will work just fine for holding down shelves. Then I come back in with the clearance drill, and I've got one of those clamp-on countersinks for the heads of the screws. That was a nice little purchase for this project. That looks like that's going to work really well. It's important that those be countersunk so you can slide the bins in and out without them getting caught, which would be super annoying. Now back to the shelves. So I'm tacking the vertical risers onto each set of shelves here. And once again, it's very important to take my time and get everything super square here, because this is the point where all the errors that I might have made in previous steps start to accumulate. Because if that framework isn't perfect that I'm building onto, then it's going to get harder and harder to fit these new pieces to it. But so far this is going fairly well. Now in hindsight, something I really should have done is worked to minimize the number of joints. For example, the risers on the fronts of these shelves could have been all one piece, and it would have been fewer joints that way. I'm not sure what I was thinking when I decided to build the shelves up modularly like this instead of just using more long straight pieces, because most of the work is in the joints, prepping and welding and grinding, so you want to minimize the number of joints. But lesson for next time. You can see that I'm using a lot of little clamps and things to support the far ends of the parts because, again, I'm working on large components by myself, so it's really helpful to have a lot of magnets and a lot of clamps to keep things aligned as you work. I'm intentionally grinding as few welds as I can on this project. I don't want to spend all my time grinding all the welds perfectly flat, but I do have to grind the welds flat where the shelves are going to sit, which gives me the chance to have the obligatory slow-mo grinding shot. Again, making sure I tack everything and measure the heck out of everything before I weld anything up, because the welding is only going to distort things more, so it better be perfect at the tack stage. If you've got an ornery corner like this one that I couldn't get to align, a couple of scraps with some washers on it to bridge over the weld there underneath can really bring things back into line. So that allows me to just squeeze those parts together with the clamp and get things back in line. Sometimes when using stronger measures like this, you'll hear one of your tacks pop, and that's good news. Now you know which tack was the problem. I'm ready for the final test fit of the shelves now. So the top shelf just sits on top. The second shelf is in 2 pieces so I can get the plywood in there. The third and fourth shelves were designed so that the plywood would go in at an angle. And I did the math so that, So my math didn't account for the thickness of the plywood. The real world laughs at your math sometimes. So I had to just take a block plane and take the corner off of this sheet of plywood so that it would slide in at an angle. Trigonometry is all well and good when everything is infinitely thin, not so with sheets of plywood. At one point while doing this, I got a splinter. A splinter! The indignity of these dead trees. I mean, metal gives you splinters too, but those just make you stronger, and MRIs are for quitters. So with a little bit of love with the block plane there, that slid right in there. Looking good. Let's do another weight test now. So I've got an indicator on there, and this is my last chance to determine if I need a vertical riser in the middle of these shelves. So I've got a whole bunch of very heavy scrap metal here. I think the total here is somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds, I think. This is about double the weight that I would ever put on a single spot right in the middle like this. And the total there is about 130 thou of deflection right in the middle there. So, obviously not zero, but I'm not the least bit worried about that. Like, I really don't think that's going to be an issue at all. Again, this is way more weight than will ever be there, and 130 thou is not enough deflection that you can even see it. So, yeah, not a problem. And I like not having the risers in there because it makes the bins easier to access, and it looks nice. Well, those shelves now make a convenient work surface for the miter saw because it's time to build the components for the sheet stock sorting system on top. So I've got a bunch of really nice pieces of 1x12 here. The previous resident had abandoned it all here, so it's very nice lumber. You can't buy 1x12s this nice anymore. So I'm going to use it for this purpose. My miter saw is not big enough to go through this in one cut, so I'm setting up an end stop on the end of the table there, and that will allow me to flip the pieces over and match that cut very easily. And I have a whole bunch of these pieces to make that are the same length anyway, so an end stop is an easy solution for that. And this method works really well. You get actually very, very good joints there with a simple end stop. I made some little furring strips, or I don't know if that's the right name for these. I'm not a tree jockey, but I glued and brad nailed those onto the base, and that's going to give some support for these when they're standing up vertically. Now it's time to really put the miter in miter saw. I'm going to lean over 45 degrees, and I'm going to cut a beveled section on the back of each of these because they're going to be sitting at a 45-degree angle, and they need a straight brace piece on the back. So that's how I'm going to achieve this. If you're especially eagle-eyed, you might be noticing that I'm cutting these on the ends of the boards and not on the backs of them like they should be. And yeah, I noticed this after they were all done, so I cut them all short and did it again on the long sides. Yeah, luckily no major harm done there, but here's the correct chamfer placed on the long edge of one of them. So I used a handsaw to finish the side cut there and then cleaned up these corners with a chisel. Those lower corners there form a little shelf that's actually going to add a lot of strength to the way that these uprights are being braced, as you'll see. With all of those made, I laid out their positions on the top surface, again at an angle, and then I glued and brad nailed those in place. So the reason these are at a 45-degree angle is because it allows me to store larger stock up here while still keeping a very narrow footprint on this thing. Again, the whole structure has to be only 20 inches deep. So if I wasn't angle parking, as it were, then the stock would have to be a lot shorter to fit up here. For the rear stringer support, I used this scrap of plywood, just not the most elegant piece, but I had it left over and I wanted to use it up, and it's sufficiently long, so I would have liked something that was a little taller, but this will certainly work. One problem I had with this wood material is that the welding magnets wouldn't stick to it. I'm not sure why. Maybe woodworkers, you can help me out. Does this mean that this is stainless wood? I don't understand. With the sheet stock section done, now I need to get it down on its wheels. So I lifted it with the engine hoist on one end and my floor jack on the other, and then I was able to wheel the cart out from underneath it and then set it down on its wheels. This is the first moment where I see how stable and or dangerous this thing actually is, and I was pleasantly surprised. It's actually extremely stable, so that's good news. I don't have to worry about rolling it around on the wheels, at least while it's empty. So I fitted the middle wheels now that the cart is out of the way. And now I can lift the sheet stock module off the top and get ready to paint this thing. I started by cleaning it up thoroughly with simple green. You know, steel stock like this from the steel yard, it comes covered in oils and goo, and there's welding flux debris on everything, and you know, you got to get it all cleaned up. I'm starting with this acid etch primer just because, well, I have a bunch of it left over from a previous project. It's actually really good stuff. It's designed to be sprayed on, but I find that it brushes on just fine. Secret is to brush it on thin. You should basically still be able to kind of see the metal through the primer. It doesn't have to be very thick. With that all primed, I then went ahead and painted it. I'm spray painting here because I'll get a nicer finish and it should be quick. Now, this thing is very big and heavy, and because of that, I had a moment of laziness and didn't want to move it outside. So I made what in hindsight was a very bad decision and painted it indoors. Now you can see I set up some cardboard there as kind of a makeshift spray booth, but I am still finding little white shadows of paint overspray on things in my shop, so strong unrecommend for this. Don't lie to yourself and think you can spray paint something indoors and, oh, I can contain the spray. You can't. You cannot contain the spray. 2 coats of spray paint, and then I can reinstall the shelves. The shelves were painted with some leftover house paint that I had. I like to paint my shop furniture white just because it really brightens up the room, helps reflect more light everywhere, and just looks nice. You can see that I've got 2 screws in the middle of each shelf, and this was again so I was leaving room for a vertical riser if I decided one was necessary, and I can at any time come back and add one later. I can just notch out this shelf and the screw holes will still be in the right places. And then I can put the now painted sheet stock module back on top. The paint job on this isn't great. You know, I was using a brush because that's all I had and some leftover paint, but it's good enough for, you know, making it look a little nicer and reflecting lots of light back into the room, which is all I want it to do. For the storage tubes on the end, I'm using these McMaster or other online metal supply shipping tubes. And you might scoff at this, and sure, you could use PVC for this, which I'm sure lots of people would, but these cardboard tubes are incredibly strong. Like, you would not believe how strong these are. I've used them for years for stock storage, and they work just fine. So I'm going to bolt these to the sides here of the rack. I probably should have done this before paint and everything else, but I didn't think of it. So I'm center drilling and tap drill size drilling those holes out, and then I'm bolting those tubes in place with very large washers. And again, this is a system that I've used for many years in other places in my shop, and it is actually very strong, even for great big, like 8-foot chunks of 1.5" steel round bar like this. The tubes don't even flinch at that. Now I've got a bunch of extra space kind of outboard of those that I'd like to leverage as well. So I want to try putting some small tubes on there. So I did a little test with some glue just to see how strong this would be. Once that had set overnight, it's very, very strong in shear, but in tension it fails fairly easily because of course the paper is layered and it just tears off. So what I decided to do is glue up these small tubes and also put some strapping around them to hold them in place. So the glue is just to keep them from falling downward, basically, just in shear. And I'm only going to be putting very light stock in these small outer tubes, 540 threaded rod, things like that, very lightweight stuff. So those are clamped in place until the glue cures, and then around the whole system I'm putting these very large zip ties, which will just act as retaining straps for the whole system, and that way the glue isn't actually carrying any weight, it's just keeping the tubes from sliding out of position. Alright, I tore down the old stockpile shelf and cleared the area and brought in the completed stock rack. As you can see, it wheels around extremely easily. Final weight on this is about 300 pounds, but one person can wheel it around no problem. Very easy to maneuver. So I just lined that up, and it's bolted to the wall, I should say. It's not just sitting on those wheels. So it's permanently installed on the building. Again, the wheels are only there to move it when it's empty, and I someday have to move this shop. I spent some time sorting out all of my scrap metal and allocating bins for each, and there's the final result. On the ends there, I've got all of the round bars sorted by type and size. On top there, I've got all my sheet stock. I've got cardboard and plate steel and softwood and all my sheet metal, all that kind of stuff. On the other end, I've got tubing and wood doweling and some bar stock. And then in the back here, all the large sheet stock, 4x8 sheets and so on, are all tucked in behind there. And you can see how the shelves are a little taller than the bins, and that's so that you can slide them out and get access to the contents, push them back in without having to necessarily remove the bin from the shelf. That's kind of an important detail. I'm chuffed with how this turned out. This stock rack did in fact absorb the contents of 6 separate stock storage areas, so it achieved my goals and only occupies the same space as that old shelf did. Very happy with this. This project may not be for everyone. I'm sure your storage needs might be different than mine and you might do things differently, but that's okay. This is how I did it, and it worked really well for me. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this project and you can swing it, hit me up there on Patreon. That would really mean a lot to me. Keeps this channel going. And I'll see you next time.